Chapter 1. The sun was setting, casting an orange-red hue over the desolate landscape of Vanter 7. Marcus Holt crouched low, his hands steady as he adjusted the scope of his sniper rifle. The wind whispered through the jagged rocks, carrying the scent of burned earth and gunpowder. The war-torn planet was quiet, save for the distant rumble of artillery fire, echoing from the far side of the Zhorin fortress. Through the scope, Marcus saw him, Supreme General Xylar. The Zhorin leader stood at the center of a fortified courtyard, surrounded by his generals, overlooking the chaos of war. Xylar's posture was regal, his confidence unshaken even as the battlefield smoldered in the distance. It was almost maddening how calm he was, as if the thousands of human lives lost didn't matter. To Xylar, humanity was just another pest to crush. Marcus felt his pulse steady, his breathing slow. His entire world narrowed to the crosshairs. This was it. One shot, one bullet. The fate of humanity, and perhaps the galaxy, rested on this single moment. "You sure about this, Holt?" A voice crackled over his comms, pulling him from his thoughts. He didn't need to turn his head to know who it was. Sergeant Lena Garcia's voice was unmistakable, strong, steady, and always grounded. She'd been by his side for years, a fellow soldier, a friend. "Yeah," Marcus replied, his voice low and tight. "It's the only shot that matters." Lena was silent for a moment. "Just make sure it's the right one. We're all counting on you." Marcus exhaled slowly and adjusted his aim. He wasn't worried about the shot. The rifle was a custom-built model, designed for precision over long distances. The wind was calm. His position was optimal, but there was something else gnawing at him. Xylar had been humanity's greatest adversary. His leadership had turned the tide of the war in the Zhorin's favor. Marcus' mission wasn't just about stopping the war, it was personal. The Zhorin had wiped out his family, and every day since had been spent in the shadow of vengeance. But the thought of pulling the trigger, ending Xylar's life, felt heavy. Not because Marcus doubted his mission, but because he knew it would only be the beginning. "Stay focused," he muttered to himself, tightening his grip on the rifle. He thought back to the briefing before the mission. The words of his commanding officer, Colonel Fedorov, still echoed in his mind. "Xylar is the key. Remove the head, and the body will fall." Marcus had heard that before. The Zhorin were a proud race, but they weren't invincible. They had proven that much on countless battlefields. But Xylar was different. He was cunning, calculating. Removing him would send a message, cripple their military leadership, and give humanity a fighting chance. The crosshairs wavered for a fraction of a second. A bead of sweat dripped down Marcus' temple, but his hands didn't shake. They never did when the shot mattered most. He pressed the trigger. The crack of the rifle's report was deafening in the stillness of the canyon. Marcus watched through the scope as Xylar's body jerked violently, his head snapping back in a grotesque twist. The Zhorin leader crumpled, falling to the ground in a heap. A ripple of chaos surged through the courtyard, soldiers scattering, shouting in panic. Marcus allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. Xylar was dead. The war was about to change. But before he could take another breath, his comms lit up again. This time, the voice was frantic, distorted by static. "Holt, we have a problem." It was Lieutenant Rhodes. Marcus' heart sank as the words sank in. "What's going on?" Marcus barked into his earpiece, his pulse quickening. "It's a trap. The Zhorin knew you were here." Marcus' mind raced. How? His position had been secure. He had taken every precaution. No one should have known he was in place, let alone that he was about to take the shot. "Get to cover," Marcus ordered, scanning the horizon with heightened senses. He could feel the tension in the air, a sudden shift. The ground beneath him trembled, faint but unmistakable. The comms crackled again. "It's worse than that, Holt. They've got a whole damn battalion on the way. We've been compromised." The blood drained from Marcus' face. The Zhorin had lured him into a trap. They had anticipated the assassination attempt. Xylar's death was meant to be the trigger for a counteroffensive, one that would cripple the human forces on Vanter 7. "Where's the extraction point?" Marcus asked, his voice sharp. "Secondary rendezvous. You're the only one who can make it, Holt." Marcus' gaze flicked back to the fortress, now brimming with Zhorin soldiers flooding out from the gates, rushing to secure the area. They were moving faster than he expected, and there was no way he could make it out without being caught. He had only one option left. "Lena," he said, his voice low, "we're going in. I need you to cover me." There was a pause, then Lena responded, "Roger that. Don't get yourself killed, Ghost." He slid down the rocky incline, moving swiftly toward the nearest defensive position. The sound of gunfire erupted in the distance as the first wave of Zhorin forces arrived, but Marcus didn't look back. His mission was far from over. Zyler's death had set off a chain reaction, but the war was far from won. As he moved through the landscape, he could hear the distant hum of Zhorin dropships approaching. His heart pounded in his chest, but his focus was absolute. In this moment, Marcus Holt, the Ghost, was not just a sniper. He was humanity's last hope, alone, outnumbered, and facing the full wrath of the Zhorin Empire. But that had never bothered him before. Chapter 2: The blast of a Zhorin grenade erupted nearby, sending rocks and dust flying into the air. Marcus barely flinched, his training kicking in as he dove behind a jagged boulder. His rifle was still slung over his shoulder, and his eyes scanned the battlefield, heart pounding. The Zhorin forces were closing in faster than he expected. "Move, move," Marcus hissed into his comms, his voice sharp with urgency. His team was scattered across the desolate landscape, each in a precarious position. He needed to get to them fast. He had barely made it a few dozen meters when the comms crackled again. It was Lena. "Holt, you're not going to make it to us in time. They got us surrounded. We're pinned down." Marcus' eyes narrowed, and he swore under his breath. He had planned this to be a one-shot, one-kill mission. Now, he was forced to abandon his position and rush headlong into a battle that was quickly spiraling out of control. Zyler's death had been just the beginning of something far worse. And now, his team was in danger. "I'm coming to you. Stay put," Marcus ordered, his voice cold and focused. The adrenaline coursed through him, sharpening his senses. The sound of Zhorin soldiers echoing in the distance told him he was running out of time. Marcus moved quickly, crouching low and keeping his profile small. His heart raced, but his mind was clear. Every step had to be calculated. He passed over terrain littered with craters and debris, each one a reminder of how desperate the situation had become. Every so often, a bullet would ricochet off the rocks near him, but he didn't flinch. The Zhorin were firing blindly, unable to pinpoint his location. He was still undetected. Finally, he reached the ridge where his team was pinned down. He spotted Lena first, her dark eyes scanning the horizon, her weapon raised, poised for a fight. Her expression was tight, but there was no fear in her. Just the calm of a soldier who had seen too much and had no time for sentiment. "Lena," Marcus called, crouching beside her. "How many are there?" "Too many," she replied, not looking at him. Her eyes remained fixed on the enemy line, where Zhorin soldiers were advancing in coordinated formations. She adjusted her scope, firing off a round that took one of them down. "We were supposed to pull back, but the intel was wrong. They knew we were coming." Marcus cursed under his breath. "Betrayal." Lena glanced at him, her eyes hard. "It's not just a betrayal, Holt. We've been sold out. There's a traitor in the ranks." The words hung heavy between them. Marcus could feel the weight of them settling in, thick and suffocating. A traitor. The thought chilled him to the bone. They were supposed to be a unified front, humanity's last stand against the Zhorin Empire. But now, it seemed they had a mole in their midst. "How do you know?" Marcus asked, his voice quiet but intense. Lena didn't answer immediately. Instead, she fired again, taking out another Zhorin soldier. She lowered her rifle, wiping the sweat from her brow. One of the transmissions was intercepted. We were supposed to hit a Zhorin supply depot, but the ambush came straight to us. They knew we were coming. Marcus clenched his fists. "So, someone tipped them off." "It's worse than that." Lena's voice dropped to a whisper. "The Zhorin didn't just have one of our comms. They had all of them. They knew our movements, our exact positions. There's someone within the operation who's been feeding them information." Marcus's mind raced. Who could it be? Who among them could betray the mission, the cause, and humanity itself. The thought was maddening. They had worked with these people, trusted them. "I'll deal with it later," Marcus said, cutting off the conversation. "We need to get out of here first." Lena nodded, her expression hardening. "We're not leaving without you. We need you, Ghost." A sudden shout came from behind them. One of their own was down, a soldier Marcus didn't recognize. Zhorin's soldiers were closing in. Marcus immediately rose, pulling his rifle to his shoulder. "Stay down. I've got this." The next few minutes were a blur of gunfire and smoke. Marcus darted between rocks, providing cover for his team as they fell back. He fired with precision, taking out Zhorin after Zhorin with each pull of the trigger. His mind worked like a machine, no hesitation, no room for error. His training was all he had left now. No more time for regrets. After a few moments, Lena's voice came through the comms again. "The extraction point's compromised. We need another plan, Holt." Marcus exhaled slowly, analyzing the situation. They couldn't move to the original extraction point. The Zhorin were blocking the way. But there was an alternate route, a hidden tunnel beneath the ridge. It would be risky, but it was their best chance. "Head for the tunnels," Marcus ordered. "I'll cover the rear." "Move now." Lena didn't hesitate. She led the team toward the hidden path while Marcus took up a defensive position. He fired, dropping 2 more Zhorin soldiers before he fell back, racing to catch up with the others. As they moved deeper into the canyon, Marcus's mind didn't rest. Who could the traitor be? Had someone intentionally set them up to fail? Was there someone in their midst working for the Zhorin? He turned the question over and over in his mind, but the answer was elusive. No one showed signs of betrayal. No one except for one person, and even that thought felt like a stab in the dark. They reached the tunnel's entrance, an old, forgotten shaft that led deep into the planet's surface. But before they could enter, a shadow moved in the distance, a lone figure, standing tall and resolute. Colonel Tyla. Marcus froze. He hadn't expected to see her. Not here. Not now. Tyla had been one of the most respected officers in their ranks, known for her tactical brilliance and loyalty to the cause. But now, standing before them with a weapon raised, her once familiar face was unreadable. Her uniform was slightly different, tattered, worn, and marked with Zhorin insignia. "You're too late," Tyla said, her voice cold. "The Zhorin already know your every move." The betrayal stung like acid in Marcus' veins. He had trusted her. "I should have known," Marcus muttered, the words feeling hollow. "You sold us out." Tyla's eyes flicked to the ground. "It wasn't my choice." Marcus' breath caught in his throat. Was she lying? Had she been forced? He couldn't afford to trust her now, not after everything that had happened. "Then why, Tyla?" he demanded. "Why betray us?" She hesitated, her grip on her weapon loosening slightly. The Zhorin didn't just offer power, Holt. They offered survival. And with that, Marcus knew there was no turning back. "You said." Chapter 3, the tunnel's damp air hit Marcus like a slap to the face. It was cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you feel small in a world that seemed far too vast. The stone walls closed in around them, the narrow passage winding deeper into Vanter 7's forgotten veins. His team moved in silence, their breaths the only sound as they trudged through the darkness. They'd barely made it out of the canyon, and now they were relying on this underground route, one that hadn't been used in years. Marcus didn't like it. He hated it. Lena, her rifle slung across her back, moved ahead. She didn't say a word, but her quick glances over her shoulder said everything. She was worried about him, about the mission, about everything that had gone wrong. And it showed. The betrayal. Colonel Tyla's sudden defection. Marcus couldn't shake the thought. The Zhorin knew their every move. They'd been betrayed from within. That much was clear. But the why, the reason gnawed at him. How had it happened? Why hadn't he seen it? He should have known. He should have been more careful. He gripped his rifle tightly. The weight of the weapon in his hands was reassuring, familiar. It was his tool, his lifeline. But it couldn't help him now, not with everything that was unraveling around him. They reached a small cavern, the walls lined with strange glowing moss. It cast an eerie green light, but the quiet was too much, too heavy. They paused. Marcus scanned the area, his senses heightened. He could still hear the distant echoes of Zhorin patrols above them, but it wouldn't be long before they realized the humans were underground. The chase was far from over. You think Tyla was forced? Lena's voice broke the silence. She spoke softly, but her tone was sharp with suspicion. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned against the cavern wall, his mind replaying the last moments with Tyla. She had looked so different, broken somehow, worn. It was hard to reconcile the woman he had once trusted with the one standing before them now, ready to throw them to the wolves. I don't know, Marcus said finally, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. But I don't think she would have betrayed us without a damn good reason. Lena scoffed. A good reason? There's no excuse for betrayal. You're either with us or you're not. Marcus didn't respond. He wanted to agree with her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone realized. He had seen Tyla's eyes, distant, regretful. She hadn't been lying when she said it wasn't her choice. But who had forced her? Who had gotten to her? We're not safe here, Marcus muttered, pushing himself off the wall. The cave felt too exposed, too vulnerable. We need to move before they find us. Lena nodded in agreement, but there was something in her eyes that Marcus couldn't ignore. Worry. She was worried about him, about how he was handling everything. She'd seen him fall apart before. She knew how much the weight of loss could break a person. And right now, it was the weight of this mission that was pulling him under. The silence stretched out as they resumed their journey deeper into the tunnels. Marcus kept his focus forward, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. But his mind was far from the present. It was back with Tyla, back with the decision he had made to leave her behind. The further they went, the tighter the tunnel became. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air thick with the musty scent of decay. It felt like they were walking through the planet's guts, its forgotten insides. But that wasn't the only thing that weighed on Marcus. It was the thought of his next step, the burden of the shot he had taken. Killing Xyler had been the easy part. The hard part was what came next. We're here. Lena's voice broke through his thoughts. They had arrived at another junction, a series of branching tunnels. The walls were slick with moisture, the ground uneven and rocky. A low hum echoed in the distance, signaling the presence of more Zhorin patrols. Marcus knew they had to move quickly. He wasn't sure how much longer they could stay ahead of the enemy. Which way? Lena asked. Marcus hesitated, his eyes darting between the two passages. One led downward, deeper into the planet's core, while the other veered sharply to the right, toward what seemed like a vast chamber. We go right, Marcus said. It's the shortest route to the old mine entrance. Should be abandoned. Lena didn't argue. She led the way, her footsteps quick and light on the uneven ground. Marcus followed close behind, his mind still churning. The more he thought about the betrayal, the less he understood it. Tyla had been one of the best officers in their ranks. She had been loyal. So what had changed? What they promised her? Don't think about it, Lena said, her voice almost a whisper. We don't have time for questions. We need to focus on getting out. Marcus shot her a look, but didn't reply. She was right, of course. The questions had to wait. The mission had to come first. He just wished it wasn't so damn hard to focus. They rounded a corner, and the faint hum grew louder. Marcus signaled for them to stop. Ahead, he could see the flicker of lights, Zhorin soldiers. He crouched low, motioning for Lena and the others to do the same. The soldiers were patrolling the tunnel, unaware of their presence. They moved in a predictable pattern, but there were too many to engage directly. Marcus gritted his teeth, cursing under his breath. They couldn't go back. Not now. He needed to make a decision. Fast. He turned to Lena, his eyes steely. We're going through. Get ready. Lena raised an eyebrow. You're insane. I'll draw them out. You take the shot. Lena didn't hesitate. She knew the drill. They had done this before, coordinating silently, moving as one. But even as Marcus prepared to step into the open, his mind flickered back to the battlefield, to the moment he had pulled the trigger on Xyler. He had killed a man, no, a leader. But what had he really accomplished? He had struck the head off a snake, but the body remained. The Zhorin soldiers ahead turned. It was now or never. Marcus exhaled slowly, stepping into the open, a flash of movement. He fired. The first soldier fell. The rest scrambled, shouting orders in their harsh language. Marcus didn't wait. He moved fast, faster than he had ever moved before. His rifle found its mark again and again, taking down the soldiers one by one. He was a blur of motion, untouchable, unstoppable. But as the last Zhorin soldier crumpled to the ground, Marcus realized one thing. No matter how many of them he killed, the war was far from over. He had taken the shot, but the real battle, his true enemy, was still waiting for him. And the weight of that knowledge was more than he could bear. Chapter for the tunnel's walls seemed to pulse with every step they took, the air thick with the damp scent of rock and stagnant water. Marcus' boots splashed in the shallow pools that dotted the floor, the sound echoing ominously through the narrow passage. His eyes scanned ahead, his mind focused on one thing: escape. The plan had been simple: get in, take out Xyler, and get out. Now, the world had shifted into chaos. The mission fractured into pieces he couldn't put back together. Lena moved ahead, her silhouette barely visible in the dim glow from the bioluminescent moss on the walls. Her steps were steady, deliberate. Every so often, she would glance back at him, her eyes betraying a flash of concern. The weight of their situation had settled on all of them, and the fear of being hunted was a constant presence. How much farther? Lena's voice was barely a whisper, as though speaking any louder might attract the attention of some unseen predator. Not far, Marcus replied, his voice tight. We reach the mine shaft in another 500 meters. From there, we can make a break for the surface. The words were meant to reassure, but they only served to remind Marcus of how little time they had. The Zhorin were closing in, and the sounds of distant shouts and boots on the ground were becoming louder, more persistent. The underground tunnel had bought them some time, but it wouldn't protect them for long. He could feel the weight of his sniper rifle against his back, its cold steel a constant reminder of a shot he had taken earlier. Xyler was dead, a leader of the Zhorin Empire, fallen by his hand. And yet, in the silence of the tunnels, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the shot hadn't been enough. Killing Xyler had been a victory, but not the kind that ended wars. It was just another step in a battle that would continue whether they lived or died. Do you think she really had a choice? Lena's voice broke his thoughts again, quieter this time. There was no need to ask who she meant. They both knew. Colonel Tyla. Marcus' jaw tightened. I don't know. I want to believe she didn't. But I can't afford to make excuses for her. Lena nodded, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. I've known her too long. She's not weak. But if she made a deal with them... Her voice trailed off, the implication hanging in the air. Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. The thought of Tyla, of the woman he had once trusted, fought beside, betraying them stung in a way he couldn't fully describe. But more than that, it was the uncertainty that gnawed at him. They couldn't trust anyone now, not even their own. The distant echo of footsteps reached their ears, closer now. Zhorin patrols, no doubt. It wasn't safe to linger here, and they both knew it. Marcus grabbed Lena's arm, urging her forward, his voice low but insistent. Move. Now. They quickened their pace, each step carrying them deeper into the dark belly of the planet. The closer they got to the mine entrance, the more Marcus could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him. He had killed Xyler, but at what cost? Was this all just another tactical play? A futile attempt to slow down the inevitable? The Zhorin were far from defeated, and he knew that killing one man wouldn't be enough to turn the tide of war. He hadn't been sent here to win. He had been sent to create chaos. And that, Marcus realized, was exactly what they had done. The mine entrance came into view, a jagged black opening in the stone. It was their only way out, a forgotten relic of a once thriving mining operation that had been abandoned after the war started. It was narrow, difficult to navigate, and far from ideal, but it was all they had. They reached it just as the sounds of pursuit grew louder. The Zhorin were close. Marcus motioned for Lena to go first, his hand resting lightly on his rifle. Cover me, he muttered. Lena nodded, her expression unreadable, and moved into the dark maw of the mine. Marcus followed close behind, keeping his rifle trained on the shadows. The air inside the mine was colder than outside, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls, amplifying the sense of isolation. They were no longer part of the world. They were beneath it. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the earth. Marcus could barely see more than a few feet ahead, but his senses were heightened, every sound more distinct in the silence. He heard the soft scrape of boots behind them, the unmistakable signs that they were being followed. "They're right behind us," Lena hissed, her voice barely audible. "We need to pick up the pace." Marcus didn't hesitate. He urged Lena forward, and they picked up their speed, their movements fluid, synchronized. The further they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, the ground beneath them becoming uneven and treacherous. They were in the belly of the beast now, and there was no turning back. Suddenly, the mine opened up into a vast chamber. The ceiling stretched high above them, supported by massive stone pillars that seemed to stretch into the abyss. At the far end, a rusted elevator shaft stood, its cables hanging loosely, an old relic of the mining operation. It was their way out, if they could reach it in time. Marcus was the first to move. He broke into a sprint, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. He glanced over his shoulder to see Lena keeping pace, her eyes sharp, scanning for any threats. Then, without warning, a blast rang out. A bullet whizzed past Marcus, grazing his shoulder. He spun instinctively, ducking behind a pillar. "Contact!" he shouted, his voice hoarse with adrenaline. Zhorin's soldiers emerged from the shadows, weapons raised, closing in on their position. They had been waiting for them. Lena's rifle cracked, the sharp report cutting through the tension. One of the soldiers dropped, but there were more of them, too many for them to fight head-on. "We don't have time for this," Marcus shouted, his voice rising above the chaos. He could feel the pressure building. They had to move, had to get to the elevator. "Cover me," Lena shouted back, taking position and firing again. Marcus didn't wait. He sprinted toward the elevator, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The sound of gunfire behind him was deafening, but it was the sound of his own pulse pounding in his ears that drove him forward. He reached the elevator shaft and slammed the button to activate it. The metal doors creaked, groaning as they opened. He ducked inside, pulling Lena in just as the soldiers opened fire. "Move!" Marcus barked. The doors closed just in time, blocking the gunfire. For a brief moment, they were safe. But Marcus knew it was temporary. They weren't out of danger yet. The war was far from over, and the weight of everything they had done, the shot, the betrayal, pressed down on him. But for now, all he could do was survive. Chapter 5. The elevator jerked to a halt with a screech of metal, the sound reverberating through the shaft. Marcus exhaled slowly, his heart still hammering in his chest, his eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by a creeping exhaustion that gnawed at him. For a brief moment, he let himself relax against the cold metal walls of the elevator, the world around him feeling distant, unreal. "We're not out of this yet." Lena's voice broke through the silence, sharp and practical as ever. She was already moving, her rifle at the ready, her eyes scanning the shadows. "We still have to make it to the surface." Marcus nodded, pushing himself upright. "We're close, just a few more kilometers to the extraction point." But his words trailed off as he glanced at the controls. The elevator had stopped abruptly, and it didn't seem like it was going to go anywhere soon. He cursed under his breath. "We'll have to find another way up." Lena looked over at him, her expression unreadable. "You really think that's the worst of our problems right now?" Marcus met her gaze. The betrayal by Colonel Tyla, the death of Xyler. It was all hanging over them like a shadow, and it wasn't going to disappear just because they'd reached a temporary safe spot. But there was no time to dwell on it. They couldn't afford to waste energy on regrets. "Yeah, it's just a setback," Marcus said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "But we still have a mission to complete. We don't stop until it's over." Lena didn't argue. She simply nodded and began scanning the elevator shaft, looking for a way out. Marcus followed her, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew the Zhorin would be hunting them. They couldn't stay in the shaft for long. The surface was their only chance to escape, but getting there wouldn't be easy. The sound of distant footsteps echoed from the depths of the mine, growing louder with each passing second. Marcus's grip on his rifle tightened. They weren't alone down here. They had been followed. "We need to move, now," Lena urged, her voice low but filled with urgency. She didn't wait for confirmation, already advancing toward the elevator's emergency hatch. Marcus followed, his mind already calculating the risks. If they could get out of the elevator shaft, they might have a chance. But the Zhorin would know their location soon enough. The idea of fighting their way out didn't sit well with him, but it was the only option left. "Got it," Marcus said, as Lena yanked open the hatch. They climbed out of the elevator and onto a narrow platform, the rough stone underfoot barely providing enough stability. Marcus took the lead, stepping carefully over the jagged rocks, his eyes always scanning for movement. They were in unfamiliar territory now, and every step felt like a gamble. The mine stretched out before them, a labyrinth of tunnels and abandoned structures. Faint light from the bioluminescent moss on the walls flickered as they moved deeper into the dark, the oppressive silence only broken by their footsteps. They had been moving for what felt like hours when Marcus finally stopped. His instincts told him something was off. The silence around them was too complete, too perfect. It was a trap. He could feel it in his bones. Lena stopped beside him, reading the tension in his body. "What is it?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. He was listening, feeling the subtle vibrations in the ground. The Zhorin had adapted to the terrain quickly. They were close. Too close. "Stay low," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Lena dropped to a crouch, following his lead. They both moved silently, careful not to make sound. Every step felt like it could be their last. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the mine, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices. "Zhorin soldiers." "We've got company," Lena muttered, her rifle coming up to her shoulder. Marcus's eyes darted around the dark mine, looking for cover. There was none. They were exposed. "Not here," Marcus hissed, grabbing Lena's arm. "We need to move. Now." They turned and ran, keeping low to the ground. The Zhorin were getting closer, their voices louder now, their footsteps growing heavier. Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about survival anymore. The betrayal, the death of Xyler, the mission, they were all merging into one crushing weight that he couldn't escape. As they rounded a corner, Marcus spotted a narrow passageway to the right. It was a dead end, but it was their only chance. They dove into it, pushing through the tight space, their bodies scraping against the rough stone. The sound of Zhorin voices grew distant, then stopped altogether. They were in the clear for now. Marcus collapsed against the wall, his breath ragged as he wiped the sweat from his brow. Lena stood beside him, scanning the tunnel for any signs of movement. They were safe for the moment. "We need to regroup," Lena said, her voice steady despite the tension in her posture. "We can't keep running forever." Marcus nodded, his mind already calculating their next move. The surface was still their goal, but the Zhorin would be waiting. They knew they were coming, and they wouldn't stop until they were dead. "You're right," Marcus said, his voice hard. "We regroup, figure out a new plan. But we can't stop. Not now." Lena turned to him, her eyes searching his face for something. "You sure about this? We've already lost so much." Marcus looked at her, his gaze steady. "I'm sure. We finish this. Whatever it takes." There was a long pause before Lena nodded. "Then let's get it done." Marcus could feel the weight of her words. They had come too far to turn back now. The Zhorin might have their eyes on them, but they had no idea what they were up against. Human resilience wasn't something that could be broken easily, not when everything was on the line. They moved forward, deeper into the mine, each step taking them closer to the surface and to whatever awaited them. Marcus knew the stakes had never been higher. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun, and now there was no turning back.